So Al-Qaeda linked to a Canadian terror plot targeting a U.S. passenger train. The deadly terror bombing at the Boston Marathon. 4 Americans, including the U.S. ambassador, murdered by terrorists in Benghazi, Libya. All of it is putting the Obama administration's policy on terror back in the spotlight. Will it affect the White House agenda? Let's talk about it with David Drucker, senior editor of Roll Call. The president often said, especially during the campaign, that Al-Qaeda is on the run. Does this prove him wrong, David?
Well, I don't know if it proves him wrong. I think time will tell how much of an issue this becomes for him politically. I think the question here, John, is do the recent events sort of overtake his agenda for the time being or for the balance of his presidency, to where he has to focus in public largely on national security and foreign policy issues as opposed to his very robust domestic agenda?
Lindsey Graham was on with us last hour and pretty critical about the job the Department of Homeland Security, which after all is an arm of the administration, did in the Tsarnaev case. I want to play a clip of that for you.
My problem with this administration is that their policies are failing. They do not believe that we're at war. They ignored signs and warnings from Libya. We haven't had one person detained as an enemy combatant for intelligence gathering purposes since he's been president.
Is this starting to resonate with voters, do you think?
I don't know yet that we've seen that, but we could see it over time. I think it pretty much depends on how the public views the president's handling of these incidents, and do they think that the president is keeping them safe. As we saw under President Bush, you can have a horrific attack on the homeland, and if you respond in a way that the public feels you should respond, if they like your response, they're going to feel good about the situation overall in terms of whether you're keeping them safe, whether you have a strategy to protect them. They're not necessarily going to look at the event itself, but the response. And so I think part of it is going to be this, John. The president has always shown a desire to treat acts of terror or potential acts of terror as law enforcement issues. He shied away from the idea of a global war on terror that the Bush administration embraced heartily. And so we will find out over time if the public approves of the president's handling and tone in how he's handled this. Now, we saw largely in the first term that they did approve. His numbers on foreign policy and terrorism were usually pretty good. It took a little bit of a hit after Benghazi, but it wasn't a fatal hit, as we now know. And so part of that is, are there more attacks that we thwart? Are there any more attacks that are pulled off? And do people feel secure? That's going to take time for us to learn. And also, what do we learn about Boston? Did an arm of the administration, whether it was the FBI or Homeland Security, really make a big mistake? Or was this one of those cases, like they say, you can stop things 10,000 times, it's the one time that gets you?
One bit of political news this morning was announced, and I wanted to get your reaction to it. Max Baucus, the Finance Committee chairman in the Senate, the guy who sort of shepherded Obamacare through the Senate, announced he's going to retire at the end of his term in early 2015. He's a Democrat in a conservative state. What does that do, first of all, for the Republicans' prospects of retaking the Senate?
Well, John, it looks really good for the Republicans to have a guy like Max Baucus with his campaign firepower retire, until you realize that Governor Brian Schweitzer may now run in his place. And I think Montanans like Governor Schweitzer a whole lot more right now than they like Max Baucus. And so the Republicans, ironically, might have been better off with Baucus on the ballot, even though he's a real dogged campaigner and a smart political operator. I think this is big news in Washington, on Capitol Hill, where Max Baucus is always at the center of the big legislative developments. He's working on a tax reform bill. Not that I really think it's going to come to fruition, but he has that kind of access and power. And so I think, for Republicans, you in theory always like to have an open seat, because incumbents in theory are harder to beat. But if Schweitzer runs, I think Republicans are once again playing defense, and they're going to be the underdog in this race, unless the president's poll numbers next year look something similar to 2010, where people had just really soured on his leadership.
Also worth noting that Max Baucus was one of the 5 Democrats who voted against the gun control legislation that just recently did not make it out of the U.S. Senate, much to the president's displeasure. David Drucker from Roll Call, thank you.
Thanks a lot.